Okay, so this is the geometry, quote unquote geometry, for staying cool and calm, being confidently more creative and useful in today's global, quote unquote, age of rage by Dan Sullivan. Yeah, so Dan Sullivan is brands himself strategic coach. Um, he's kind of like the entrepreneur's coach. Really like all of his stuff. So this book, I forget why I picked this up, but I think all of his stuff is super interesting. He's actually a Johnny, a St. John's College graduate, like I am. And he talks about the geometry here. So at St. John's College, we study Euclid. And Euclid sort of, the way he lays his stuff out is he has a bunch of principles and axioms and postulates at the start. And basically everything kind of lays on top of those foundations, and then there are propositions that get proved from those foundations, and then newer propositions that get proved based on those new propositions that just got proved. And so it's sort of like building a house where you get the foundation right, and then everything else kind of follows from it. And so I think that he calls this an age of rage in which people are upset about what is happening in life. And so let me read this quote. Introduction: three rules handle it. You're increasingly free from bothers and worries. Freedom from bothers and worries is especially important in these times when a great many people are making up fantasies to scare themselves silly. These individuals take advantage of global communication technologies, TV, the internet, and especially social media to rage about imaginary phantoms that are oppressing and threatening. But none of this negativity describes you. None of what bothers them bothers you. None of their outbursts or their raging or their fearful predictions disturb you. You find it odd that in a great era of material abundance, so many people feel increasingly powerless and stuck. As others grow more fearful and frantic, you're increasingly cool and calm. You have a way around all of their negativity. You've mastered three fundamental rules that enable you to ignore and bypass all of this self-created fear and worry in today's world. Yeah, and so basically in this book, he talks about three principles, which he calls the geometry for staying cool and calm, and I'll read those in a second. But what's interesting about all of his books is he gives several different ways to consume it. So he gives the physical book, he gives an audio book, he has cartoons in the book that you can look at. He also has video interviews that you can watch. And so I've consumed multiple forms of this book. And anyway, in one of the books he talks about, or one of the videos, he talks about with his co-host, whose name is escaping me, but she's really good too in these audio commentaries, asking him questions about it. And he talks about COVID, but to me, what immediately comes up is TDS, sometimes known as TDS or Trump derangement syndrome, and that's when I really started noticing what he calls the age of rage. And for some people, this just seems kind of absurd. I guess people on the right kind of see it as absurd, and the people on the left really believe it. And this has made me really question belief systems in general on what is true and what isn't, and what you can know and what you can't. And I think Trump is probably the person where you see the most, where people are absolutely convinced that he's, Hitler, and other people couldn't think he's further from the truth, or that's further from the truth. And the one thing that's not talked a lot about is this movement called the Walkaway movement after Charlottesville, where it was a gay guy who was, super anti-Trump, and he basically, after Charlottesville, Trump said, well, there's good people on both sides, which can be interpreted two ways, right? One way is that he was actually supporting these neo-Nazi kind of hate crimes. The other way is that there are actually people on the right who who are kind of marginally associated with these people, but they wouldn't agree with them, and they're good too. And the walkaway movement was basically realization that the media was portraying Trump as basically a sympathizer with the hate crime. You know, it was a hate crime in Charlottesville where a guy, um, you know, ran down a bunch of protesters. Um, you know, and it was related to the South and that sort of stuff. So, anyway, but that's, you know, when Trump came into office, I think that's when I really started noticing the age of rage, and and I also think that Trump, and it's not talked about in this book, but Trump has this certain very masculine energy, and we've largely been in a sort of pro-female world, and so there's this sort of like big dick daddy energy by Trump, which really angers the people on the left. But anyway, so that's kind of background where I started to see it really in pop culture, whatever your thoughts are on it. But let me read his 3 rules because I think this honestly explains a lot of Trump too, but any entrepreneur. And so the first rule, okay, and so this is kind of the heart of the book. So the first rule is number 1, everything's made up. Number 2, nobody's in charge. And number 3, life's not fair. And it's interesting because all these 3 are kind of the belief system of people who've come up through the school system, that, you know, someone's in charge, that there's a right way to do things, and that life should be fair, right? Almost the millennial rallying cry is about fairness and equality, right? And so it's really interesting seeing these 3 rules. But yeah, so let's go through the first rule. Everything's made up. So when I first read this, I immediately thought of this clip from Steve Jobs. So I want to play this right now, and it's Steve Jobs, and this was an interview he did. This is from the Santa Clara Historical Association. You can look this up, Steve Jobs' Secrets of Life.
When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But life, that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, you know, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
Yeah, so I found that clip very interesting. It really shaped me, and because I realized a lot of what entrepreneurship is, and this is specifically with physical products, is you go through life and you discover these little annoyances, right? Like, oh man, it's so annoying, I've got to clean out this tea thing again, you know, or whatever it is, right? Or wouldn't it be, I mean, it's terrible that I've got to board the airplane like this, or whatever it is, right? You'll run into all these little annoyances in life, and most people just accept that that's the way it has to be. But the entrepreneur says, well, why can't it be different, right? I was hearing the story of I forget this website. But it's basically people who give real reviews about. It's not. It's not. I forget the title. Man, I wish I could remember the name of this website. But basically, it's Glassdoor. That's what it is. And basically, it's a website where you go and you can give reviews on what it's really like to work there, and you give them anonymously so that people can see kind of through the glass doors, right, about what actually happens at these companies and like the bad stuff as well as good stuff. And I was listening to the story and how that company was founded, and it was that the CEO was running some other company, and one day he printed the salaries of everyone. He had his secretary print it, or he printed it, and it turned out instead of printing to his private printer, it printed to the kind of public office printer, and he found it in time so that no one could see the salaries of everyone. But he thought, well, why does the world have to be like that, right? Why couldn't you have a company where everyone knows what everyone's salary is, right? And so that was the foundation of the glass door, right? And so when I heard Steve Jobs say this, I thought about physical products, but it was not until this rule number one, right, which is everything's made up, is that it's not just that, it's not just physical things that are made up, which, by the way, if you look around and you start thinking about that, it's like everything was just made up by someone who said, hey, I want it to be a little bit different. The shapes of houses, or how big your windows are, or, what coffee cups are made out of, or the fact that we drink coffee, right? It's just anything and everything was just made up by someone, right? Just one day someone said that. But it wasn't until I started reading this book that I realized, no, it's not just these physical things. It's actually everything that we think is just completely made up by someone, right? At some point, and this includes language. And so he makes a good, Dan Sullivan spends a while talking about how other species don't make things up because they don't have language. In the audio version, he also talks a lot about why English has kind of taken over the world, or why everyone sort of speaks English. And I think and he talks about how it's because it's the most permissive, and it takes stuff that other languages have made up, right? And they'll just incorporate it and use the language or just use the word. And so he talks about pizza, that was just something some guy in Italy made up, right? Let's put some dough and some, sauce and some of our leftovers on top and bake it. And, English just calls it pizza, right? They didn't make it up. They just sort of co-opted it or took it. But, I was also thinking about why English is sort of becoming the world's language. And it's also because of capitalism, right? And what is capitalism? It's the ability for people to make things up, right? So it's not some central government that makes things up. It's organic, grassroots people making things up. So yeah, everything's made up. And this goes into language, and he talks about even things like fairness, right? Fairness being, or equality being, something that was made up. He talks about how in the 1600s, or it was like the 1400s, that's when the idea of people being equal, or things being fair for people. I think I forget which one, that only arose in 1400, like AD. And so before that, people didn't think that, it wasn't even something that could be talked about. And so it's not just people making things up, but actually putting the label onto it for language. And so the second principle here is nobody's in charge. And, this makes me laugh. I've been thinking about, for both these, that I bought a t-shirt from Chris Corner, who runs a podcast called The Corner Office, and he started like 80 businesses, and he has this t-shirt that says, "You can just do things." And it basically means you don't need anyone's permission to start anything, right? You can just come up with an idea and go and do it, right? You don't need the degree. You don't, you don't need permission to start talking to people about something, or to go and create something, right? And so that's kind of very related to this. that everything's made up and nobody's in charge. And that's what Dan Sullivan really means here with nobody's in charge. It's that because people are constantly making things up, that there's really, it's not like only certain people can make things up, right? And if that were the case, then they would be in charge. But really, everyone's kind of in charge because everyone can make new things up. And like I said before, this is not just making up physical products. This is making up new ideas, new ways of living, right? New ways of being. If you don't like a rule structure, right, or some law, you can write to a congressman, right? You can start a rally. This can get into political action kind of stuff. But what is that stuff, right? They're just people making things up, right? Right? So, but yeah, so nobody's in charge because everyone can make things up. And then the third thing is life's not fair. And I immediately thought of, something that being a millennial myself, I was often taught that like everything should be fair, right? Everything, like if I do something, I should get some result. And I would always be told by my parents and older people, well, I would say, well, that's not fair. And they would say, well, life's not fair, right? And there's a lot of wisdom in that. But, I always wanted to say as a kid, well, sure, it's not fair, but I want it to be fair, right? Or it should be fair. And they never really had a good rebuttal to that, aside from, well, that's just the way life is. And so Dan Sullivan here is saying life's not fair because people are making things up. And those new things that are made up, if they're useful to other people, that confers an advantage to others who are going to use that thing. And so that might be a new concept, right? So, England and the US made up this idea of equal rights. Well, that's been very useful to people here versus, let's say a caste system, right? Where certain people are more in charge than others, right? So, so someone made that up, and that's been very useful, right? But that means that life is not fair. That living in certain countries is better, than living in others, right? And I really take this to be about AI right now. And so the people who can use and create AI have an unfair advantage versus those who aren't. But you could extend this to any technology. Of course, just AI is obviously the most relevant. So really interesting book. I think when you're in this, and a lot of this also is about internal versus external locus of control. When you are making things up, you are in the internal locus of control, right? You control your future. When other people are making things up for you, you think life is not fair, and why are they in charge, right? And so that's really external locus of control. He talked a little bit about how a lot of organizations, and you saw this with 37 Signals and DHH during the pandemic, and Coinbase, I think, was another big company where you saw this, and both of those companies basically outlawed politics, right? So they realized, the CEOs there realized, or the people in charge, quote unquote, in charge. Of course, no one's in charge, according to this. But that the people who were working there were, making something else up, right? They were making up this idea that everything at work had to be about politics, and the people who were running it decided to make something else up in response, which was that we weren't going to talk about politics at work, right? And so there would be a separation between work and sort of life, right? So anyway, really interesting book. Want to talk about a couple other parts here. So one is this idea of guessing and betting, and that he says even the future is made up. That there's only really the present, and the future is just an abstraction. So he talks a lot about abstractions. since I was reminded of St. John's, I was reminded of Mr. Grenke, who's a tutor at St. John's, and he would probably take a beef with this idea that it's an abstraction, because abstraction actually means, in Latin, abstrare means to cut away. So when you abstract something, it's like you see the whole and then you cut away the parts. And so I don't think it's really abstraction that he's talking about. It's more of like a concept or something like that. But yeah, one of the ideas here is that everyone is guessing and betting about the future. So, so I wanted to just read this part. The future is an abstraction that no one can possibly know, but you can become better at guessing and betting. The people who are the best guessers and betters are the people who have the greatest awareness of what other people are guessing and the greatest understanding of what other people are betting on. I find that the more I enter into other people's worlds, this is page 37, by asking them about their experiences and their thinking, the better equipped I am to create new value for them. Asking questions and getting people to think about their thinking is a unique capability of mine, so that's Dan Sullivan, and it's how I uniquely become better at guessing and betting. So getting more future smart. You're not only guessing and betting on a unique and unpredictable future, but your ongoing ability to do this is unequal. So this is another case where being unequal is. So by the way, he considers this thing about guessing and betting sort of foundation, like it's resting on the foundation of these other three sort of propositions, if you want to call them that. Your goal is to be increasingly better day after day at your guessing and betting. This is called being future smart. It's one of your most important abilities. Yeah, and so then he basically talks about, that, and step 2, taking charge, this is 38, means you're taking 100% responsibility for your guessing and betting. Entrepreneurs do this more than any other type of person on the planet. Yeah, and so being future smart has two parts. One, this is page 39, guessing and betting on something new, and 2, guessing and betting on what already exists. This comes down to what new thing you think is possible on the one hand, and what existing thing you can depend upon on the other. And one of the best bets you can make is on something you create yourself. Yeah, and so this actually really reminded me of a quote by Alan Kay. So Alan Kay was the inventor of a programming language called Smalltalk, which was the predecessor to Ruby. And Smalltalk and Alan Kay was someone who Steve Jobs, funny enough, ran into at the Xerox PARC research facility. So Xerox back in the day, it's hard to think of right now in 2026 about copiers being like this new technology. But Xerox basically figured out, this copier thing is eventually going to go digital, so we need to create something. And so what they did was they hired all these people out of Stanford, all these PhDs and whatever out of Stanford, and undergrads too, just smart people, and put them in a room, and they ended up creating object-oriented programming, and that was through Smalltalk. And so this guy Alan Kay is a fascinating guy. Steve Jobs ended up coming up with a lot of the stuff from Next was based on Smalltalk, and then later that's what got acquired by Gil Amelio at Apple because they needed a new operating system. And so really, in a lot of ways, Alan Kay is sort of responsible for Steve Jobs in some ways coming back to Apple. So, but the reason I bring him up is that he has a very famous quote, which is the best way to predict the future is to create it, right? And I love that quote. Now, Dan Sullivan, in one of his videos, he talks about how no one can know the future. In contrast to Peter Thiel, right, who is obviously way richer, Peter Thiel would say, well, your job is to know the future. As an investor or as a business owner, is to know the future, right? Is to predict the future and be out of consensus. That's where you make all your money. Dan Sullivan disagrees with that, right? He would say, well, no one can know the future because everyone is just making stuff up. And you don't know what someone else is going to make up tomorrow, right? But yeah, this idea of, well, what is the best way to actually predict the future is to invent it, right? And and all this stuff I think runs through the theme of one of the things that Dan Sullivan constantly talks about is how over time you can become sort of like the best version of yourself, or most like yourself, as you're engaging of this process of what he calls the unique ability. Um, and so he talks about how they went through, they didn't really have to deal with these cultural things that were made up, right, of bringing politics into work, which Coinbase and 37 Signals had to deal with, because they had this idea of unique ability, right? And so everyone's unique. You're, by definition, if you're unique, you cannot be equal. And so, the goal of an employee should be to figure out where they can best shine, right? And do that, and they will be unequal, almost by definition. But a theme that I see through Dan Sullivan's work, and it's one that really resonates with me in entrepreneurship, is that you just feel most alive when you're creating stuff. There was a book a while back by a psychologist that was talking about, and I forget the title of it now, but it's about how humans feel the most alive when they're creating, and feel the worst when they're destroying. And you can take this to any level, right? It's like, you feel most alive when you're creating a baby, right? And you feel the worst, if you're actually ripping down structures, like you're getting a divorce, right? Or someone dies, right? These are like the worst, kind of the worst things that can happen. And so, yeah. So anyway, just super interesting book. Like Dan Sullivan would say, these are three things that he just made up, right? So, but yeah, I just love this stuff. Let me read a little more, just because I find him so uniquely insightful. Um, those telling this is page 50. Those telling transformative stories. People who stay cool and calm in today's world will also be great transformative storytellers. They'll tell stories that include failure, mistakes, and setbacks, all of which they've learned from in order to improve themselves. Entrepreneurs like to hear about another person's experience of failure. What was the failure, the setback, or the mistake? And then, how did they respond to that? How did they overcome it? Did they get to the other side? This really tells you that the learning capability of entrepreneurs is way beyond people who will never talk about failure. Yeah, and failure is one of these things that I really think school does not teach you, like learning through failure. And yet we all kind of understand that, like, that's the best learning is experience, and experience brings failure, right? So, but then this part, stories, in this page 50, stories are the best way in which we organize our thinking about our experience. And it's not just what we communicate to other people, we're telling ourselves stories. Yeah, and so this is like a huge thing, I think, in Landmark or it used to be called EST, was to realize that everyone's living in a certain perspective, and that's supported by these stories, right? And the stories are not the physical reality of what happened. They're a story that we've told ourselves to organize reality, to make it make sense to us, right? But when you see other people telling their stories, you realize that they're all kind of bullshit, So, just one other part from page 62 I wanted to read. The most fearful person is just as creative as you are, but they're making up stuff that is self-destructive. Day after day, they're inventing things about all the dangers they're facing and all the forces that are opposing them. Yeah, so when you see people, and he actually talks about this in his video about, things like climate change. Honestly, I see a lot of the stuff on the left as being this, like, and a principle from Ray Dalio, which I've thought a lot about, is one of his principles is anything you're worried about, you don't have to worry about. And anything you're not worried about, that's what you've got to worry about. Ray Dalio talks about how, everyone's worried about climate change. So we're putting in systems that will make sure it doesn't happen, and those can be wide, on lots of different levels, right? Reducing carbon footprint, but even stuff like Musk trying to go to Mars is a way to, if the catastrophe happens, right? Well, we still have a place to go. Humanity survives, right? And so, but it's all the stuff that no one's worried about. That's what you have to worry about, right? So, who was worried about, COVID in January of, 2020? Like, no one, right? February, some people started getting worried. March, people were really worried, right? But in January, no one was worried about it, you know. And so, yeah, it's all the stuff you're not worried about. That's what you've got to worry about. But, that's just a made up principle, right? So, yeah, and so they're depressing the people who are making up just self-destructive things. They're depressing themselves, and they're getting a reward for being depressed. They give themselves an excuse to not try any harder. You're the opposite. Your confidence grows with every collaboration, and you're always getting better at finding the right people to collaborate with. Part of your growing skill is to sense who those people are through trial and error, through guessing and betting. Yeah, and this whole thing of trial and error, I think, is the way of the entrepreneur, and it's not this sort of a priori top down kind of way, right? It's this, I'm going to try something and fail, and I'm going to learn from it, and I'm not finding yeah, and so this is from 39. Every time you use your guessing and betting, this is about guessing and betting. Every time you use your guessing and betting ability, you gain something. Even a bad guess is valuable because you learn from it. Yeah, and so, if you take it that you can learn from a class or a book or whatever, Robert Kiyosaki has this whole thing about the cones of learning and how basically each level is like a lower fidelity. And so the highest level of fidelity is actually experiencing something, right? Maybe a second level is, going through a simulator, right? So you could try to fly a plane, probably wouldn't be very smart, right? But you could sit in a cockpit simulator, right, with Microsoft, whatever, flight simulator or whatever, and that may be more or less realistic, but that's going to be way better than reading a book about all the instruments, right? And then reading the book and how active you are there might be way better than watching a video, right? Watching a video might be better than a podcast, right? And so each of these are levels of fidelity. And partially this is how active you are. But yeah, so the number one thing in entrepreneurship seems to be, in terms of learning, is actually doing, right? And something I've learned is that you'll often, for someone who overthinks, they want to spend a lot of time thinking about something, but often you can't know that by just thinking about it. You need to act, and then acting gets you data, which then allows you to think about it, which then allows you to act to get more data. And so it's this kind of, trial and error, Nassim Taleb calls it tinkering, right? Where you tinker with stuff, and that's how you get feedback. And so I've learned that often, if you're not sure, just doing something gets you new information that you couldn't have known beforehand. And so, anyway, this is kind of the guessing and betting process that Dan Sullivan is talking about. So, anyway, geometry for staying cool and calm, being confidently more creative and useful in today's global age of rage by Dan Sullivan. Awesome short book, 60, 70 pages. Can read it in an afternoon. Keeping this in mind too, right? And anytime you're not happy, right, it's probably because you're not creating. So anyway, that's it.